So I am here today representing Travelers Rest State Park. For those of you who are at Dunrovin, you are right up the road. And so I hope that you'll have a chance to come down here while you're in the Lolo area and take a walk around the park. I see the horses are out today. I hope that you've all had a great visit there with our neighbors. They're wonderful folks. So Travelers Rest State Park. Well, let's do this first. We're going to just kind of go through my presentation. Anybody who has a question at any point, I've kind of got your faces minimized here, but feel free to shout out, unmute yourself and ask a question whenever you need to. So on your virtual visit to Travelers Rest today, we're going to talk a little bit about our place along the Lewis and Clark Trail. I'm going to give you some background about this particular place, Travelers Rest State Park. We'll talk a little bit about the expedition. And then we're going to focus a lot on the archaeology at Travelers Rest. Travelers Rest is the only archaeologically verified campsite of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So we take that claim to fame pretty proudly. And I'm going to walk you through what was discovered here that pinpointed the actual campsite of the Lewis and Clark expedition here at Travelers Rest. If we have some time, we'll talk about I'll show you some replicas of items that were used by the Corps of Discovery, maybe some items used by the indigenous people of this area, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Okay, so let's just start with where we are along the trail. We are the map that I have up there right now is the entire Lewis and Clark Trail. A few years ago, there was a section added to the east of St. Louis all the way back to Pittsburgh, which we call the Eastern Legacy of the Trail. You may or may not know that Pennsylvania was a really important part of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Meriwether Lewis went to Philadelphia to be trained by some of I'm going to say the greatest minds of the time, but to be trained by some people who were considered experts at the time. And he also really started the trip in Pittsburgh because that is where the keel boat that was used to travel the Ohio, and then the Mississippi Missouri rivers was built. So the entire Lewis and Clark Trail starts in Pittsburgh and ends in Astoria, Oregon. And to show you kind of where we are along the trail, if I move my mouse, I'm hoping you can see it, but I am located right over here. And actually, folks who are at Dunrovin, here's where you are too, right where this sort of 57 is over here, where Missoula and Lolo are located. So the trip was a long one, and Lewis and Clark decided to camp at Travelers Rest twice. They camped here September 9th to the 11th in 1805, and they camped here again June 30th to July 3rd, 1806 on the way back. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have archaeological evidence here, is because they used this place for multiple day stops 2 times. Okay. So a little bit of the background of why we're a state park here. Way back in 1999, some volunteers, just some folks who really are into the Lewis and Clark story, wanted to preserve the site. They were concerned that the National Historic Landmark marker was in the wrong place, and they wanted to do a little bit more investigation, but they were really concerned because there was some development planned for this area. So when this headline, "Alarm Bell Sounded Over Travelers Rest," has to do with the fact that in 1999, the National Trust for Historic Preservation named Travelers Rest one of the 11 most endangered historic sites in the United States. Okay. So a couple of years later, following some initial archaeology, we have this headline that says board okays expansion of Travelers Rest Park. This is the State Parks Board decided that it would be okay to purchase some land to add to what was being preserved here. A couple years after that, the researchers, the archaeologists, submitted their final report pinpointing the exact location of the campsite here. And then in April of 2006, the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Department of the Interior approved moving the National Historic Landmark from where it had been placed previously at the confluence of Lolo Creek and the Bitterroot River. You guys at Ten Rovin have seen the Bitterroot River all week. Lolo Creek flows into it just south of the sort of center of Lolo. And the campsite, after the archaeology was done, the National Historic Trust decided, or the National Trust for Historic Preservation approved moving that National Historic Landmark from the confluence of the creek and the river to where the campsite, where the archaeology showed the campsite. This is the only time National Historic Landmark has ever been moved based on archaeological evidence. So pretty cool for us. And then just a few years ago in 2017, at the National Trust for Historic Preservation came out and said that among all of the most endangered places that they had identified over the course of 30 years, Travelers Rest was one of the greatest success stories because we were able to prove the site and preserve it. Good stuff. Okay. If you come to Travelers Rest, this is what you're going to see. This is our trail through the Cottonwood Forest. We have a bridge that spans Lolo Creek. Here you can see a bunch of kids who were here on a field trip, peering over the edge, probably tossing leaves over to see how they float. And this is the trail leading from our visitor center to our, what we call our Crossroads Plaza. We'll talk about that again in a minute. And then finally the campsite where Lewis and Clark camped.
Sent me a picture, they weren't even done, and they are putting the ins.
Okay, so I wanted to show you a few pictures of our visitor center. Our visitor center was once upon a time a machine shed for a ranch that our neighbors owned. But over the course of the history of the park, we've grown from 12 acres to a 65-acre park, largely due to the generosity of our neighbors, their willingness to sell land at a discounted rate to both the park and the nonprofit partner of the Parks for the Friends group. And so we've expanded over the years. In our visitor center now, we have different exhibits pertaining to Lewis and Clark, to Native American history, and also to natural history. You can see down here in the lower left, this is one of our fabulous volunteers, Dave, who is teaching a field trip in the room where I am today. This is our classroom. Acquiring this building allowed us to expand all kinds of different activities, which has been great for the park and the community. Okay. So back to our Crossroads Plaza. This is where you'll find, if you were coming here on a usual field trip day, our flagpoles, right? And I'm going to talk about these flags a little bit. So, all right, everybody recognizes the US flag, right? Here's the state of Montana flag. The motto of Montana is Oro y Plata, or gold and silver, and that is because we are the treasure state. Mining has been an important part of the Montana history since its settlement by Europeans. We also fly here the Flathead Nation flag. This land where the park sits was the traditional homeland of the Salish Kellispay people. And we try to be incredibly respectful of their history and their connections to this land, as well as the Lewis and Clark story. We do a lot of programs in partnership with the Flathead Nation. And the Flathead, I have to say this, the Flathead Reservation is north of us. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes were combined on that reservation. The Salish and Kellispay people had a shared language. The Kootenai speak a different language, and in fact are most related to Indigenous people in Canada. Some of the politics of combining those tribes have repercussions today. So we work most closely with the Salish and Kellispay people, although we do also work with the Kootenai tribe occasionally, because where we sit was traditional homeland for those folks. Okay, this is another flag that we fly at Travelers Rest, and it's kind of a fun one. This is the flag that was approved by the US Congress in 1803. And so it's the flag that the expedition carried with them. You'll notice that there are just 15 stars. So we've gone past, the Betsy Ross circle of 13 stars, because at this point, Vermont and Kentucky had been added as states. So we're up to 15. Interestingly, though, this flag also has 15 stripes. The Congress, or the folks that were in charge of flags, I guess at the time, thought that they would add a stripe as well as a star for each new state. But after this flag, they started to realize that that was going to be some really skinny little stripes after a while, especially following the Louisiana Purchase, right? All this new territory coming in. There was no way they were going to be able to keep adding stripes. So after this flag, they went back to just adding a star and not adding stripes. Just a little flag trivia for you folks today. All right. So here we are back at Travelers Rest. This is an old map, similar to one that William Clark would have made. And you can see that we're sort of at this crossroads, right? We fly our flags at the Crossroads Plaza because the campsite was at a crossroads. And this is a crossroads of ancient Indigenous trails. So from this point, the tribes would move north through Missoula or along the Blackfoot River to the east to hunt for bison. And both the Salish, the Kellispay people who called this their homeland, also other tribes came through this crossroads to move to the plains to hunt bison. To the west of Travelers Rest, you would find the Nez Perce tribe or the Nimiipuu people. Their homeland is in what is now Idaho and Washington states. But they would travel through they would move through Travelers Rest on their way to hunt bison. But the Salish and Kellispay would also move west in order to get salmon. In the Salish language, this little area, is called Timsum Clee, which means no salmon. For, I'm sure, many reasons, but there are no salmon east of the Bitterroot Mountains. So the Bitterroot River does not have salmon in it. If you travel west over the Bitterroot Mountains into the Lochsaw, the Snake Rivers, you can fish for salmon there. And then finally, to the south, you would find the Shoshone people. And the Shoshone people were sort of the hookup for horses in Montana. Their area or their territory ranged far south. And so the tribes in the Southwest who had horses or brought horses in, especially from the era of the conquistadors, and began to breed horses, brought those horses north into this area. So this was an important place for different tribes to meet and trade for important things. And you can see today, these same trails really follow the highways of Montana. This is Highway 93, Highway 12 to Idaho, and then this would be Highway 200 east of Missoula. So when we talk about our highways today, most of them started off as Indigenous roads. Okay, So you can see from this star, we're way up here in the tip, the very edge of the Louisiana Purchase. So I think most folks know that in 1803, Thomas Jefferson negotiated with Napoleon to purchase this giant swath of land. You know, we had our original 13 colonies over here on the East Coast. We were starting to move west and add a few more. There were territories here, the Ohio territories, the Missouri territory. But all of this land was, it was contested. Spain had a claim as well. But that purchase from Napoleon really put it into the United States. And so Jefferson hired Meriwether Lewis, who had been his personal secretary. Meriwether Lewis worked in the White House with Thomas Jefferson. And they had grown up near each other in Virginia. So they had known each other for a long time. Jefferson trusted Lewis and asked him to lead this expedition. Lewis, whether understanding his own strengths and weaknesses or just knowing that this was going to be a big undertaking, wanted somebody he trusted alongside him. And so he went to William Clark, who he had served with after, or in the military after the Revolution. They were both Army men. He and Meriwether Lewis invited Clark to come along and sort of be his co-captain along this trip through this vast territory. So here we have the key players. Here's Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, and old Tom Jefferson here. And there were three basic goals, right, of the expedition. Thomas Jefferson knew that trade was going to be important from ocean to ocean. The Canadians were already starting to explore their most western territory. There had been encounters among Canadian traders north of the border. And so Jefferson, with the acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase, really wanted to hopefully find a way to move goods from the Atlantic to the Pacific by boat. So one of the key goals of the expedition was to find a water route. But Jefferson also was a super curious guy. He wanted to know what was out there, right? He wanted to know about the tribes. He wanted Lewis and Clark to create friendly relations with the tribes, but also to sort of write down everything that they observed about them. What were their customs like? How likely were they to be trading partners? Things like that. And then finally, he also wanted to know all about the plants and animals that were in this part of the continent. At the time, Thomas Jefferson actually expected them to find woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers roaming the western part of the country. They had seen the fossils of those animals in the east, but they had never seen them alive. So they wondered, all right, maybe they just moved west. So there was an expectation that they were going to see all kinds of different plants and animals, which of course they did. Okay. I wanted to take a minute to, I should stop for a second and just see, does anybody have any questions? You feel free to unmute yourself and just kind of shout out if you have a question.
I noticed you didn't mention the Blackfeet. Did they have involvement with Lewis and Clark?
So the Blackfeet absolutely had involvement with Lewis and Clark. Unfortunately, some of the, I would say the saddest days of the expedition involved an encounter between Lewis's party in 1806 and the Blackfeet, where some young Blackfeet warriors were actually killed by Lewis and his party. I will say that Lewis and Clark arrived at Travelers Rest from the south. So on their way to the west, they didn't really encounter the Blackfeet. On the way back home from Travelers Rest, they split up, and Lewis took a party of about 9 people north along the Marias River. I think they had been kind of warned. The Shoshone and the Salish were frequently raided by the Blackfeet for horses. And so they knew that the Blackfeet were kind of a fierce territorial tribe, and the expedition, the large party of the expedition stayed out of their way, but when Meriwether Lewis encountered them up in Two Medicine, it was not a friendly exchange, unfortunately. Okay, I hope that answers your question. One of the things that I am very passionate about making sure that people understand is that the Corps of Discovery was really a Corps of diversity. It was made up of Army folks, yes, but also a whole lot of other individuals, and within those Army folks, individuals who had lots of different skills that they brought to the Corps. And one of the reasons that they were so successful is that they had all these different people involved. So just wanted to highlight a few of them. This is George Drouillard. George Drouillard was Métis, half French and half Omaha tribe, Native American. And he was hired as a guide and translator, sort of hunter. He became, though, one of the most valued members of the Corps. He was an incredibly reliable, skilled outdoorsman. And he once, they were separated, that group of 9 men that encountered the Blackfeet. Drouillard was separated from them for a few days, and Meriwether Lewis wrote a beautiful entry in his journal about how much he hoped his friend would come back, because, or that they would, you know, find each other. He was concerned that they hadn't seen him for a few days because he was such an important person to Lewis. This is York. York was the enslaved man belonging to William Clark. William Clark and York had grown up alongside one another because York's father was enslaved by Clark's father. And when the expedition departed St. Louis, York came along with Clark. We call him here an involuntary ambassador. His service on the expedition was not voluntary, but he was an incredibly important part of the expedition. Tribes, specifically indigenous leaders, were very impressed by York, not just the color of his skin, but he was over 6 feet tall, a very strong man, and as described in the journals. There's a wonderful story in this area from the Salish tribe about encountering York. And it was the tradition in the Salish tribe that if you had been in a battle and lost somebody close to you, you would black your face with ash or coal. And so when the Salish people encountered the expedition and they saw York's black skin, they thought that this party of 33 men must have just been through a terrible battle and had lost people that were important to them because of York's skin. And it's one of the reasons why the Salish people showed the Corps such great hospitality, was because they saw his black skin as a sign that they had been recently defeated in battle and lost important people. York was also, I mean, as shown in this picture, he's got a rifle and he's hunting. This is something he never would have been able to do back home in Missouri. But over the course of the expedition, he proved himself a valuable hunter, a trader with the Native Americans. Just a really important figure in the expedition. This guy is Nathaniel Pryor, and I gotta tell you, I can't really figure him out. Pryor was, if you drive through Montana, you're gonna find the Pryor Mountains. There's a town of Pryor, Montana. There's lots of stuff named for this guy. He was really trusted by Clark, but he was actually elected to become a sergeant on the expedition. The only one person died on the Lewis and Clark expedition. His name was Floyd, Sergeant Floyd, and he passed away probably from appendicitis very early in the expedition. And when the captains came to the enlisted men and said, all right, you need to elect somebody from your ranks to be elevated to sergeant, the men chose Pryor. So clearly, lots of people trusted him. And yet, on the trip back, he was entrusted with moving all of the horses. He lost them all. Like they ended up having to build boats on the fly to move down the river because they had lost all the horses. There were a lot of kind of mishaps like that for Prior along the way, but the captains loved him and they named a lot of stuff after him. This is Sacagawea. Most folks have seen her before. Sacagawea was not exactly a guide as we're sort of taught in popular history, but she did give lots of good information about landmarks that she recognized. Sacagawea was born Shoshone in Idaho, south of Travelers Rest. Those are the folks that brought the horses. But she was captured by a raiding party, and when she was about 12 years old, and then lived with the Hidatsa and Mandan people in the Dakotas. She was, there are varying stories here. She was either the wife of Charbonneau, who was a French trapper who came on the expedition, or she was won by Charbonneau in a card game. To be clear, being the wife of Charbonneau was much more traumatic than one would think of getting married today. Her story is much more complex than we are generally led to believe by history books, and I encourage everybody to read a little bit more about Sacagawea. She was, at the time of the expedition, somewhere between 14 and 17 years old. She had had a baby in February, and then as the expedition left her village with her husband as a translator, she carried her son, Jean-Baptiste, on her back in a cradle board all across the country to the Pacific Ocean. One of my favorite stories about Sacagawea is also about the Shoshone and horses, since the folks are Dunroven. Horses are an incredibly important part of this story. And when the expedition got to the Rocky Mountains, they realized that they were not going to be able to get to the Pacific Ocean by boat, but they had no horses. So they cached their boats, hid them, and then started off on foot. They were desperate to get horses because they were carrying, each man was carrying about 60 pounds of gear. And they were on foot through the Rocky Mountains. They knew to get to the Pacific Ocean, they were going to have to cross many more mountain ranges. And they came to a place that's now called Camp Fortunate, where they encountered the Shoshone people for the first time. And they were eager to trade for horses. And to make that process much simpler, it turns out that the chief of the band that they were negotiating with was Sacagawea's long lost brother, Kamehameha. They had not seen each other since she was captured as a child. And there's a beautiful story in the journals of their reunion, their tearful reunion. And he actually made a special gift of a horse to Sacagawea when the expedition left their territory. Couple more folks. This is Pierre Cruzat. Pierre Cruzat was also a French national, or a French, woodsman, I guess you would call him. He carried a fiddle across the country. He was a very experienced boatsman. He's credited with saving a lot of gear a couple of times because he was so great on the river. He unfortunately did not have great eyesight, and one of poor Pierre Cruzat's claims to fame is that he shot Meriwether Lewis in the ass because he thought he was an elk. By the time the expedition got to parts of Montana, the small party of 9 that encountered the Blackfeet, Pierre Cruzat was on that none of their uniform clothing was remaining. They were all wearing skins, and Cruzat's terrible eyesight caused him to take a shot at what he thought was dinner and turned out to be his captain. Lewis had to then once they got to the river, he had to lie on his stomach in the boats as they traveled on the Missouri River while he healed. And then finally, this guy is Silas Goodrich. You can see in this image by Michael Haynes, he's got a whole bunch of fish. He was just a guy, just an army guy that came along on the expedition, but it turns out he had a real skill for fishing. He often was a hero to the Corps for being able to bring in lots and lots of fish when they were very hungry. He also is important to our story about Travelers Rest, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. So this image is a famous painting of the Corps of Discovery at Travelers Rest. You can see here in the center, Lewis and Clark. Over to the side here is Sacagawea and her husband, Charbonneau, and their baby, Jean-Baptiste. Down here is a guy named Old Toby. Toby was a Shoshone guide that brought them to Travelers Rest and suggested that they stay here for a few days before crossing the Bitterroot Mountains. Up here you can see York next to Clark, also participating in the conversations. And then these are Salish Indians that met the expedition here at Travelers Rest. We talked about the highways. These are kind of the indigenous trails are sort of the super highways of the time. And I'm going to go back for a second. So you can see right here, there's sort of this joining of a whole bunch of these different trails. Well, that is where we are at Travelers Rest in Lolo. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about archaeology, but I'm going to take a pause again to see if anybody has questions. Actually, I think I'm going to stop sharing for a second and see if people want to raise hands or if you have any questions. Anybody?
I have one.
Yeah, go, Chris.
Yeah. What would they have had that they could have traded for the horses before going across the Rockies?
That's a great question. We're going to talk about it a little bit more in here in a minute, but Meriwether Lewis, before they left on the expedition, he went to Philadelphia and got a whole bunch of items to trade. So he brought with them a lot of, there's a whole list actually, you can find it online, called Indian Presents. They had different kinds of trade beads. They had specifically, and things that were useful and made of metal were incredibly important because a lot of the tribes in the western part of the country did not work metal at all. Another thing that they had were these. If I stand my dark blue shirt, maybe you can see a little bit better. This is called a piece medal. You can see Thomas Jefferson on the front, and for Jefferson's medal it's kind of hard to see in my screen here, but they're clasping hands with a peace pipe and a hatchet or an axe. Every president from Jefferson through Ulysses S. Grant minted a peace medal, and they were used as gifts to tribes. So that's kind of cool. How many of you are thinking that are out down the road are thinking that you're going to come to Travelers Rest? Is there anybody that's going to have time to come over here, do we think? Yeah, maybe not. Okay, so I'm going to whip through the archaeology really quickly here, and then again, interrupt me if you have questions. I know it's kind of hard when I'm sort of this talking head in the middle of a room, so please feel free to ask me anything. Okay.
Just want to let you know it's not because we don't have time or not interested. Most of us have chronic pain and illness.
Gotcha.
So
okay, well, I appreciate
important,
that.
Also important not to talk too fast.
Okay, well, thank you for just give me a high sign and to slow me down if you need to. Let's see, we're going to go back here. I know I do tend to talk really fast because I'm trying to jam in all kinds of information. So the archaeology at Travelers Rest, we talk here about this term preponderance of evidence because no single piece of the archaeological evidence that we found is enough to prove the site. But all of the pieces of evidence taken together were enough to say, yes, this is the place. And as I go through each different piece of evidence, you'll see how the story builds. So the first thing that the archaeological team did was they looked at the journals. This image shows you what the journals of Lewis and Clark look like. I actually got to go, they are in storage in Philadelphia at, I'm going to forget the name of the organization. The Philosophical Society. It's down there near Independence Hall. You can actually go and see the original journals. And in the journals, Meriwether Lewis wrote, "We camped on a large creek which falls in on the west. As our guide informs that we should leave the river at this place, and the weather appearing settled and fair, I determined to halt the next day, rest our horses, and take some celestial observations. We called this creek Traveler's Rest. It is about 20 yards wide, a fine, bold, clear running stream." So I guess item number one here is that Meriwether Lewis named the creek Traveler's Rest, not the place. But he talks about moving in or moving up that creek a ways from the river. And that was one of the first things to help us pinpoint the site, was actually looking at the celestial observations that Meriwether Lewis took here and moving up the creek a little ways. And you can see, all right, here's the Bitterroot River. Oh, but use my mouse. Here's the Bitterroot River, right? And this is where the original National Historic Landmark was for Traveler's Rest, where the Bitterroot River meets Lolo Creek. But Lewis talked about moving up the creek, and one of the other members of the expedition, John Ordway, wrote down, "We camped on the bank of a creek which runs into the small river about 2 miles below." So he estimated that they walked along the creek for about 2 miles. Today, we measured at about 1.5 miles. That is pretty close. So that was the clue that the journals gave us, that they actually left the trail by the river and walked up this creek. So we had a good place to start. The next thing that the archaeologists did was they used really simple technology of a metal detector. A piece of property near where they thought the campsite was about to be developed, and the owner allowed volunteers with metal detectors to sweep the property, and this is what they discovered. This is called a tomback button. It is a button that is consistent with the military uniforms that the Lewis and Clark expedition would have been wearing. So it's possible that one of the guys just dropped a button while they were camped here. It is also possible, though, that they had traded this button. So I have this little entry from the journal. It says, "Brass buttons is an article of which the people are tolerable fond. The men have taken advantage of their prepossession in favor of buttons and have divested themselves of all they had in possession, which they have given in exchange for roots and bread." So we were talking about items that the Corps had to trade. Well, one of the things they traded were their very own buttons off their uniform. There are several instances in the journal where you can read about the men being hungry and cutting a button off their uniform to trade for a piece of fish, some roots, or other food. So the button is a great clue, but again, it's not enough on its own. It could, maybe somebody from the Corps dropped it here, but maybe an Indian that they had traded it to dropped it. Equally likely, because we know that different tribes gather here. Okay, so the third clue came with a new technology. Now this is much more, I always say it's above my pay grade in the science area. Like, I'm into history. I don't really get the science, but they used something, infrared overhead flights, and then something called magnetometry. And magnetometry, you basically send signals into the ground, and the imagery that comes back up shows you where the soil has been disturbed in a way that's probably not a natural occurrence. In this particular case, it showed these areas where it's really red and yellow. And that's an indication of a hot fire burning. It would be a fire like a brush fire that came through, right, would not have burned that hot. Native Americans would not have had a reason to burn fires that hot. But the Corps of Discovery did have a reason. We're going to talk about that. In those areas where it showed that the ground had been disturbed, the archaeologists were able to uncover some rock that had been cracked by fire. Again, just showing that these fires were really hot. And finally, they did use carbon dating, and they were able to date these campfires to somewhere between 1785 and 1855. Well, the Corps camped here in 1805, so it's right within that range of dates. The next thing that they found, also digging in those campsites, were the reason that those campfires were so hot. They found some lead. This lead was probably spilled as somebody was making bullets. So we knew that the tribes here did not work metal. They wouldn't have needed a fire hot enough to melt lead, that the Corps of Discovery did. They were able to take a look at this lead and determine that it was originally sourced from a mine in Olive Hill, Kentucky, which we know was supplying the US Army at the time of the expedition. So again, a really good clue that this is where they were. In the journals, there was a note by William Clark that he wanted some of the men to work on repairing guns and making bullets while they were camped here in 1806. So he said, had all of our arms put in the most prime order. 2 of the rifles have unfortunately burst near the muzzle. Shields cut them off, and they shoot tolerable well. One, which is very short, we exchanged with the Indian who we had given a longer gun to induce them to pilot us across the mountain. We caused every man to fill his horn with powder and have a sufficiency of balls, etc. Those balls are lead balls that they would have shot from their muskets. This next few pictures that I'm going to show you, this is a volunteer here. His name is Lloyd Priest, and he comes out and he actually makes lead balls. He has a historic firearm, a musket similar to what Lewis and Clark would have carried. And so you can see him here. He's using a brazier, not a campfire, but he's melting lead in a little bucket. He then uses a special spoon to pour the molten lead into a mold, which then creates that round ball that they come out looking like this. So you can imagine doing this over a campfire. It would be pretty easy to miss the mold as you're pouring or get jostled and spill a little bit into the campfire. And that is the lead that was uncovered by the archaeologists here. Somebody just spilled something. Finally, within the campfire, they also found a bead. We talked a little bit before about the fact that Lewis brought trade beads with them. They brought lots of different kinds of beads, but the blue ones were the most valuable by far. Tribes in this area made their own beads out of materials that they could here, but they could not replicate the color blue. There's no material occurring naturally in this part of the country that could make this blue color. In fact, these beads were manufactured in China and then traded to Italy and then traded to Philadelphia. And eventually this one little blue glass bead made it to the campfire at Traveler's Rest. A great story from the journals talks about, and it's sort of synopsized over here, one of the natives here had a robe of sea otter skins of the finest fur I ever saw, which the commanding officers wanted very much. They offered 2 blankets for it, which the owner refused and said he would not take 5 blankets. He wanted beads of a blue color. Well, it turns out that by the time they got, this happened on the Oregon coast, and by the time they got there, they had traded so many of the blue beads, they didn't have enough left to get that coat. And Captain Clark wrote about being very disappointed because he would not take a different trade. All he wanted was blue beads. Okay. This shows, this little map was drawn by a man named Baron von Steuben. Anybody know where Steubenville, Ohio is? That's named for Baron von Steuben. He was hired first by George Washington during the Revolutionary War because the men were at Valley Forge. You may have heard this story. The men were getting sick. They were dying in dysentery. The camps were not very well laid out for purposes of hygiene. So von Steuben gave them this map and said, all right, well, if you lay it out this way, everybody is going to be healthier. He said, put your supplies up here and then your campfires. And then the officers get to sleep closest to the campfires. And then the enlisted men further out. And so Lewis and Clark would have followed this same order of encampment, being military men. And the last thing on the map, which you don't see here, would have been the latrines. And oddly enough, we found Lewis and Clark's bathroom here at Travelers Rest. And the way that we can prove it is from these pills. So I said that Meriwether Lewis had met with some experts in Philadelphia. One of them was Dr. Benjamin Rush. He was considered the finest physician in America. And he gave Lewis a supply of what he called his bilious pills, which the men called thunderclappers. I always say when I do this field trip for fourth graders, the men would take one of these pills and just like thunder, boom, you'd have to poop. They were purgatives. At the time, medicine said if you don't feel well, there's something bad in your body, you have to get it out. So you take one of these pills. They are made of something called calomel or mercurious chloride, also known as salts of mercury. Now, we would never put mercury in our bodies today, right? We know better. It's totally bad for you, but they didn't know at the time. And what happened here was the archaeologists found where they thought the campsite would be based on von Steuben's map, or where they thought the latrine would be based on that map. They dug there and they found within that soil high levels of mercury. And that's the only way that there would be high levels of mercury in that soil is because that's where the men were taking these pills and pooping them back out. We saw earlier that picture of Silas Goodrich with the fish. Well, he figures importantly here, not because of fishing, but because he was being treated with these pills for the pox, which was likely a venereal disease that he caught and some of the other men caught from some of the indigenous women that they met at their winter camp in Oregon. So they were being treated for venereal disease with these pills, and then they pooped them back out, and there you go, shit happens at Travelers Rest. So here is where the campsite would have been today. And if you ever came down here, you could take a look and see it. I will say for those folks that are up at Dunroven, and I'm going to wrap up and let you ask some more questions if you have any, but the trail here is accessible if you're at Dunroven, and it is a half-mile loop if that is a distance that you think you can manage. It's a fairly level trail. The only incline is up over the bridge and on the other side. We'd love to have you come and see us here. Okay, so that's my story about Travelers Rest and Lewis and Clark, and wondering if you have any other questions about that history or about this place. Okay.
How did Lolo Creek get its name?
Lolo Creek get its name. Okay, this is a fun story. So Lolo in general, the name Lolo, there are two theories about how we got the name. There was a French trapper here named Laurence, and there is some thought that Lolo was a nickname that the tribes gave to Laurence, the French trapper. But there's another theory that I actually like better. There was a universal trade language among the tribes. you often hear about Plains Indian Sign Language, so a sign language that the tribes used to talk with one another. There was also a trade language that sort of originated on the Pacific coast. And in that language, the word Lolo basically means kind of like Sherpa, somebody who carries stuff. A Lolo schleps your stuff. And so because this corridor along Lolo Creek from Idaho into Montana was such an important trade route, there's some thought that that's how we got the name, because this is a place that you carried stuff to trade. So 2 different possibilities. Okay. Well, that's all I've got for today. I'm so grateful to you guys for paying close attention and listening in. I'm sorry if I went a little too fast.
No, it was perfect.
Oh, good.
Thank you
Good.
so much.
You're so welcome.
It's so exciting to learn about the characters.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and we just keep learning more. So keep on reading.
There was a question I had that I popped over on the internet and it didn't. Is there any evidence to believe that Lewis and Clark might have been intimate?
That Lewis and Clark might have been intimate
Or
with one another.
Yeah, in a relationship together.
So I will say that the theory has been posited. There's no good evidence. We do know that Lewis, how do I want to put this? There are a lot of theories about Lewis's mental health, and part of that might be around his ability to find his place within the societal norms of the time. Clark went home, got married, had kids. He actually adopted Sacagawea, his son, and raised him in his home. Clark became governor of Missouri. Like, he just kind of was able to fit within what people expected, right? Meriwether Lewis had a much harder time with that. He had, there's a wonderful new book called So Hard to Die. And it's written by a husband and wife team. He is a physician and she is a psychologist. And they talk a lot about the possibility that Lewis was bipolar, and definitely that he had, well, in the book, they talk about the high levels of alcohol just consumed in general by the population at that point, right? Without refrigeration, the best way to keep things safe to drink is fermentation, right? But Meriwether Lewis died very young, and most likely by suicide. So this book, So Hard to Die, is about why they think that suicide is the most likely answer. So there's nothing in the journals, there's nothing in their letters, there's nothing contemporaneous that would indicate categorically that they had a relationship with one another. But there's definitely been some conjecture that a part of Lewis's inability to succeed in society was because he was just different in some way. Does that help?
Thank you for that response. That's
Yeah.
really helpful to what I might want to research further.
Can I
Thank you.
talk? Can I talk? Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Oh, hi. First, who were the authors of that book?
So their names are David and Marty Peck, P-E-C-K.
Wait a minute. Write it down, Dan. Here.
Okay. I can put it in the chat too.
Okay, if you spell it. Spell it.
So their last name was Peck, P-E-C-K.
Okay, I'll find it.
Okay.
I think I can find
And there are lots of books. This one is just very recent. And David Peck has written a lot about the medicine of the expedition as well, and how ingesting mercury pills
Yeah.
could have affected the mental health of the men on the expedition as well.
Okay, I also want to say, I happen to be out in Montana, staying with my daughter Terry
Oh,
during the anniversary in the early 2000s of the years. And the wonderful Missoula Daily newspaper
mhm.
every day published the entry of the diary of Lewis and Clark. And I loved it. And you can get the book in paper. I was a little late for today, but today's president, you were excellent. And you know, for people that you want to read and follow up on this, and it's wonderful to read because it's not long chapters. You can just read
Right.
day by day. And for people that just like to pick it up or just get your nose in it, and so many of the things, you know, you mentioned are, you know, detailed in there. I loved your presentation, and I
Oh.
think almost everybody would love to read it from every point of view, the history, the geography. Now that you're out there and you see actually where these people were and the magnificence of the nature, every entry,
Right.
every entry, you can understand these men were in nature. And they
Yes.
benefited and sometimes suffered, but and you're right there in the place. And we're in Florida now, and I used to live near Philadelphia.
Okay.
Montana is just an assault to your senses, beautiful. And you read it in that, and you see even long ago when it was totally a wilderness.
Yeah.
And I would recommend it. It's easily, if every library would have that, where it's very easily available in paperback, but don't be
Right.
intimidated, because you can just read it day by day, and really enjoyable, really enjoyable.
So,
I love the
what is that
presentation. This is very nice.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Chris, you were saying?
What is the book that she's talking about called?
So I'm going to put again in the chat. So there's two resources. Day by day, I wanted to show you, there is Gary Moulton is an author. He's a professor in Nebraska, and he transcribes all of the journals. So there is a book by him called Day by Day. But I also encourage you to Google Day by Day Yellowstone Public Radio. What the other speaker was just talking about, during the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition, Yellowstone Public Radio recorded a journal entry from every day of the expedition, and they are still available online. So if you, I don't have a direct link, I'm sorry, but we often use them, and it's sometimes, for me, it's easier to hear it than to read it. One of the things about the journals, if you're reading the actual transcription, their spelling is terrible, right? This was before there was a dictionary of American English. So they were just spelling things as it sounded. One of the great stories that we tell kids who come here on field trips, we always say spelling doesn't count at Traveler's Rest, because Captain Clark wrote about mosquitoes, which he hated, right? Absolutely just tortured by mosquitoes. He wrote about them often in the journals. He spelled the word mosquito 19 different ways and never got it right.
Could I comment on that?
Yes, Chris. Oh, I can't hear you.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Chris.
Oh, shit.
There you go. That's better.
You can hear me?
Yeah, that's better.
Sorry, it's my computer. So I'm an English major who studies a lot about language. And go ahead.
Okay. All right. The last thing I'm gonna put in the chat here is my email address. Please feel free to send me any other questions, or if you're looking for any resources to read more about the expedition. You can find a lot of great resources online still. And there is lewisandclark.org, I believe, also has a lot of daily information about what the journey was like as they traveled across the country. And a lot of information. It's from the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. They do a great job. Okay. All right, well, everybody, thank you again so much. I appreciate you. I hope that your meeting continues to be rewarding for everybody and you're connecting, whether you're in person or online. I know how important it is. So thank you again so much.